Pendragon 6th Edition is a tabletop role-playing game by Chaosium published in 2024 and said to be the final or ultimate edition of the game. It was the last project that Chaosium founder and original creator of Pendragon, Greg Stafford, was working on before his untimely passing. Pendragon has always had a sort of legendary status in the RPG world for being an Arthurian fantasy RPG that remains faithful to its core literary inspiration. That work of literature being The Death of Arthur by Thomas Malory, published in 1485. That 2-volume book compiles 1,000 years of Arthurian folklore and legend into one authoritative compilation, almost like an English Bible of folklore. Pendragon aims to gamify this literature from the perspective of the knight, and it completely ignores the trappings of its major contemporary, Dungeons & Dragons, in every possible way. It is its own paradigm in terms of game design and roleplay. Greg originally published Pendragon in 1985, and it changed hands no fewer than 4 times before coming back home to Chaosium in 2018, at which point it started the long road to this final edition. I say long road from the perspective of a consumer and buyer of RPG products because the actual release of this game seemed a bit cursed. Between August of 2021 and October of 2022, Chaosium published 13 design journal blog posts about the development of this game. It got audiences really fired up for this so-called Ultimate Edition. But then there was radio silence for 8 months, and then suddenly they put out the starter box set. I remember seeing this starter set box at Gen Con 2023, and I was completely sidelined by it because I'd been expecting and anticipating this game since 2021 when they were publishing those blog posts. They just sort of plopped the starter set out into the world without much fanfare. And then they announced that they were releasing the full game in March 2024, but didn't. And then they announced the release in April of 2024, but didn't again. And then finally, the full rules came out in June of 2024. And again, I was surprised at how quietly they released this game. Just like the starter set, they just sort of threw the product out into the world and I guess hope for the best. Just for the record, I like Chaosium and all of their games, and I want to show as many people as possible what this final version of Pendragon has managed to accomplish. In this video, I want to show you the contents of the starter set. If you'd have me cut to the chase, I'd say that this game is brilliantly conceived for what it is able to do, which is motivate you as a player to act and think like an Arthurian knight. But it holds on to some legacy design motifs, such as highly detailed combat minutiae. I'll show you exactly what I mean in this video, and you can be the judge for yourself. But first, I want to show you the physical items that make up the starter set. The starter box comes in a surprisingly slim form, maybe 1.25 inches thick. The cover is a sturdy, thick cardboard with full color satin finish. The game's mechanics call for a single D20 and a handful of D6s, which is what you get here. These are very attractive dice. I like the look and the regal colors. There's a what's in the box sheet with a bit of ad copy on the back to get you curious about Chaosium's RuneQuest RPG. There are 3 booklets in the set. The first one is Book 1, Adventures of the Sword in the Stone. This is a choose your own adventure meant to introduce you to the rules of the game. They did this in the Call of Cthulhu 7th edition starter set, and it's great. Production cost wise, it might be a little extravagant and sort of an inefficient way to break in a new player into the rule set, but from a user's perspective, the guided solo adventure is a really comfortable way to learn the basic mechanics. The second booklet is called Book 2, The Fabled Realm, and it's a 68-page rulebook that I'm going to cover in detail in this video. Without having read the full core rulebook yet, I feel like this booklet really does contain everything I need to run this game. The chief thing that it seems to lack is character creation rules, but again, this is 68 pages of rules, so it really does stand on its own as a playable game. The third book is called Book 3, The Sword Campaign, and this is a 52-page introductory campaign that presents 3 scenarios that altogether aim to give you a good idea of the Pendragon experience, from its yearly rhythm of play to all its basic mechanics. I will also be covering this booklet in some detail in this video. Somewhat oddly, there are 4 folios that each serve as a rules appendix. These pages really should have been included in the rules booklet instead of as separate loose folio sheets. My only guess here is that the publisher had a page limit for the booklets, and going over the page limit would have forced Chaosium from a staple binding to a glue-bound booklet, which would have been more expensive. That's my guess. If you know why they did it like this, please let me know down in the comments. There are 17 cards that you punch out from these smooth cardstock sheets, and they serve as encounter and opportunity quick references in the third book's adventure scenario. And finally, there are 8 pre-generated character folios. Do people actually write on them directly? I definitely feel more comfortable using photocopies of these in play. Actually, one practical problem with them, whether you use the original or a photocopy, is that the skills and trait numbers are all sort of hard-coded into the sheet. But in play, you're changing these numbers after just about every session. So you'd kind of have to awkwardly scratch out these numbers and write the new stats nearby or something, and it could get messy really fast. As for the paper and color ink quality, it's great. They're nice. But if they had included just one blank character sheet as well, I think this would have been pretty much a perfect starter set box. The good news is you can get blank Pendragon 6e character sheets from the official Chaosium website. I've left a link below to where you can grab those. If you're planning on playing the starter set with these pre-gens, I'd suggest just printing out a blank character sheet and transcribing all of the stats and details from the pre-printed sheet. It will make your gaming experience go a lot more smoothly. Okay, so this 68-page booklet covers the basic rules of Pendragon 6th edition, and like I said, I found them to be surprisingly comprehensive. As far as the setting of the game, it's basically a folkloric version of 6th century Britain, Arthurian Britain, if you will. The island is divided into the north, Cumbria, Cambria, Loggers, and Cornwall. Society is organized by way of feudalism, which is essentially a king at the top who owns everything, but who grants parcels of land to lords and dukes who manage that land and grant smaller parcels of it to lower lords who may or may not then grant land to knights. All those folks are the nobility, and at the bottom of society is the peasantry, who actually do the work of working the lands and producing the food and other goods and services. In this game, you always play as a knight, who is this individual preoccupied with their glory, a combination of renown, reputation, prestige, position, fame, and infamy. All knights have 3 responsibilities: a responsibility to be a soldier for their lord and to obey every command, a responsibility to give advice, offer themselves as hostage and provide their sons as squires, and a financial obligation to pay their lord's ransom and to foot the bill for their lord's marriage and things like that. As far as daily tasks, they involve things like guarding, riding patrol, standing guard, weapons practice, hunting, horse care, escorting VIPs. The duties aren't very different from that of a professional soldier actually, except that they owe their loyalty to a liege instead of a state or nation. The basic mechanic of this game is a lot of fun. It's a roll under d20 system, and you're always rolling against one stat or another. For example, if you were in a situation where your knight had a choice between being merciful or cruel, the GM would ask that you roll against your merciful trait. Since all traits are pairs that total 20, you could have a merciful versus cruel trait set of, say, 13 and 7. And when you rolled your d20, your aim would be to hit a 13 or under. If you roll a 13 in this case, it's considered a critical success, and you enjoy extra benefits, such as a check mark next to this trait, which will allow you to have a chance at leveling it up at the end of the in-game year. Rolling a 20 would be a fumble, in which case you might suffer some extra narrative penalties, but incidentally, you'd also earn a check mark for the opposite trait. And again, check marks mean that at the end of the year, you get to roll a d20 for a chance to increase this trait. If you're thinking that a year is a long time in-game, in Pendragon, that's pretty much one game session. Anytime you're rolling against another character in an opposed roll, you are still rolling against a stat first to see if you're successful or not. And if you are, then you compare your roll against the opponent's. This means that opposed rolls can result in a winner and a loser, a tie, a winner and a partial success, or 2 losers. As far as unopposed rolls, they are at the heart of the mechanics, and you're doing them for almost every kind of check in the game. Let's go back to the merciful versus cruel example for a sec. If you were to have failed that roll, you would then roll again against your cruel trait, and if you succeed that roll, then your character has to choose cruelty for that situation. If you failed the roll on cruelty, then you can choose to act either with mercy or cruelty. Everywhere else on your character sheet, it's essentially the same thing, where you're rolling a d20 and trying to match or roll under the stat listed. Of course, there are all kinds of modifiers that can add or detract from your roll result, like injuries, the environment, social context, etc. The traits actually start to affect your knight's reputation in a community. If a trait is between 16 and 20, it's considered a famous trait, and the people in your county or your community know you for it. If a trait reaches the maximum of 20, it is considered an exalted trait, and people everywhere know you for it. But it also means that your character has to choose to use that trait in situations where the pair is rolled on. Because think about it, if you're rolling a d20 and trying to get at or under 20, you're always going to succeed. The only exception to this is if there's a modifier that temporarily pushes the trait below 20 for a roll. GMs will have players rolling on traits to make decisions, carry out tests, both social and physical, and for providing hints and clues in a narrative. Passions are a different set of stats for your knight, and along with the traits, are a huge driving force in what makes this game so interesting. Players have ratings under 4 different kinds of passions. Fidelitas refers to personal loyalty. Homage is loyalty to one's lord. Fealty is a lesser loyalty that can be sworn to multiple lords, and homage always takes precedence. There is the category of fervor, which includes any kind of love or hate for a person, place, or group. By default, your knight harbors a love for family. Then there is adoratio, a worshipfulness or reverence for a god or a lover. The adoration of a beloved is so powerful that you get roll bonuses in certain situations, but also risk the condition of misery. Finally, there is civilitas, which refers to social obligations. This includes chivalry, the concept that the strong should protect the weak, and that knights should act honorably towards ladies, commoners, and other knights. Hospitality is the belief that guests in your house must be honored and served. As you can see, there are blanks in the passions where you fill in your own entries in each of these 4 categories. Here's the deal. Once per session, a player can roll to provoke any of their listed passions. If they succeed, they get a chance to increase that passion come winter phase, which is the end of the year I was talking about earlier. And if they fail, there's a so-called passion crisis. And a fumble means that they lose a point in that passion. GMs can also call for a passion roll anytime it makes sense, and players can roll on their passion anytime that a passion is consistent with a course of action that they're making in the fiction. A critical success on a passion roll grants you a +10 to a single skill or trait, one that can last as long as a duel or whatever situation has evoked that passion in the first place. A regular rolled success will grant you +5. However, with a passion crisis caused by a failed roll, you roll against that passion and risk madness, which puts your knight out of the game until the GM deems you fit to return. Or more likely, you'll pick up melancholy, where you mope around for about a week. The conditions of melancholy and misery can be cured by a friend talking you out of it, but in both cases, a failed attempt will lead you to attacking the friend until one of you is subdued. Which is to say, player knights in this game are extremely moody, unstable, almost ridiculously melodramatic creatures. They're passionate to the point of psychological instability. There are 2 tracks that define the progress of your knight more than anything: honor and glory. Honor is a measure of a knight's integrity, decency, and morality, and it's the driving force behind every noble person's behavior in this society. The other 2 pillars of society, the clergy and the peasantry, have no need for honor because the former are concerned only with God, and the latter are considered too busy trying to survive and work to be bothered at all. The GM dispenses points of honor in drips and drabs for heroic or, well, honorable deeds, but there are all kinds of situations where a knight might lose honor. Sometimes when such a situation arises, it can be resolved with a simple roll against a trait or a passion, the failure of which will result in an honor point lost. Knights can also lose honor narratively by not stepping in and stopping some evil, or participating in some evil like killing a prisoner. I thought this was interesting. There is a minimum of 10 honor points lost for, quote, working magic, which is to say there might be magic in this game, although it doesn't seem to be addressed in this starter set. Glory is kind of a different thing altogether from honor, whereas with honor, you're constantly trying to gain it and defend it, but glory can't be lost, and you earn it by the hundreds or even 1,000 points at a time. It's not a measure of how good a person you are. You can be a completely rotten murderer and scoundrel of a knight and still have a soaring glory score. But whatever you do to earn glory, you need witnesses or alibis to corroborate your deed. This is actually true of honor too. People have to see you doing the thing in order for it to count. As your glory score goes up, you get rewards and increases to your recognition skill. I thought this was pretty funny. In the winter phase at the end of the year, you get a scaled bonus of glory depending on your appeal stat, which is a measure of how good looking you are. You are also rewarded glory each year for traits that rank highly. So I'll be honest with you here, as much as I am in love with the traits and passions mechanics of this game, I did not find the combat rules to be nearly as inspiring or original. This is where you really see the basic roleplay or BRP framework really stick out. BRP is the underlying rules foundation for many of Chaosium's games, including Call of Cthulhu and RuneQuest, and it's fine, it's very serviceable and thorough. But in a way, there's just not much for me to report here. I think the most important concept is that you are largely rolling an opposed roll against an opponent in combat, and referring to this chart to see what the outcome is. If you recall, with opposed rolls, there are 5 different potential roll results because you're first rolling against a trait or stat and then comparing your roll to the opponent's. So you have this 5x5 matrix. One thing worth noting is damage. Notice that if you crit, you add 4d6 worth of damage on top of whatever your attack delivers. Combat can be utterly lethal in this game, especially if you consider how long it takes to recover from injuries. We'll cover that in a minute. I don't want you to get the impression that this game has a combat system that was copy-pasted from the basic roleplay SRD. It's very much a lovingly crafted and detailed knight-oriented fighting system, complete with a squire roll for receiving a new weapon or a fresh horse in combat. Well, actually, look here. This list of most common actions will give you an idea of how knightly the combat is. It's the result of decades of design iteration and thankfully some simplification in this latest edition. But my personal tastes lead me wanting something maybe slightly more simplified than even this. There is a lot of language defining the ins and outs of a mounted lance attack. And here you have all these different stats to refer to depending on which little follow-up action you choose. This is fine. There's nothing bad about this level of minutia, but it carries with it a sort of banality that does conflict with the brilliantly original mechanics of traits and passions. Here's a tidbit I found interesting. Knights are not supposed to use bows or crossbows in combat since that is considered dishonorable. The only exception is if you're being besieged in a garrison and defending against an assault. This actually brings up an interesting point. The GM or someone at the table really needs to have some grounding in the ins and outs of what is and isn't honorable in 6th century feudal Britain. Maybe the core rulebook covers that topic more extensively. Maybe one way to very quickly show you how combat works without getting too into it is to show you a weapons table. Here you can see the skill that you would roll against to see if you hit, then whether or not you can use it on a horse, then the damage. When it says character's damage, that's referring to an actual derived stat on your character sheet that every knight has, which is X number of D6. There are other ways that damage can be tallied up as well. Then advantage lists some special feature of the weapon, and disadvantage lists if and how a weapon can be broken. The booklet here gives you 2 pages on horses. I imagine that the core rulebook will contain an expanded discussion on horses, given the theme of the game. Okay, so the injury and death chapter was an eye-opener for me. Long story short, it takes forever to recover from injuries in this game. It actually reminded me a lot of RuneQuest, except in the world of Glorantha, there are all kinds of spells for magical healing. In Arthurian Britain, even with attentive medical care after a major injury, you're laid up for weeks. There's even a table that shows you how you could aggravate your injuries if you move around too much while convalescing. Fortunately, this game's time scale is very broad, so a few weeks is not that big of a deal. But getting seriously injured is a big deal if, heaven forbid, your knight is involved in 2 fights in a row. Knights can increase their wealth by ransoming other knights and lords, as well as looting. There's a deeply simplified presentation of the winter phase, where at the end of each in-game year, you take a shot at leveling up every trait, passion, and skill that has a check next to it. You roll 1d20, and if the result is higher than the current stat, then you increase it by 1 point. You can also voluntarily train up skills, and then you tally up your glory. You also get a core stat increase for every 1,000 glory that you've gained, and there is no upper limit on your core stats. Book 3, the Sword Campaign, is a collection of 3 scenarios that each represent a year in game time, which again comes out to about 1 or maybe 2 sessions of play. In this video, I just want to briefly take you through the first of the 3 scenarios so that you get a sense of the actual depth of the intended play experience and the pace and flavor of the action in the game. Naturally, there are going to be some spoilers here, so you could just skip to the conclusion of this video if you really need to, but the booklet also does mention and almost encourage you to take the stories off the rails a little bit. I think the most important feature of Pendragon, and one that sets it apart from most other RPGs, is that time really is measured in terms of months and years more than anything. You're meant to have social moments and combats, but on the whole, you are fast forwarding through huge periods of your knight's life and getting only to the most interesting moments. The design goal there is to 1, skip all the menial parts of a knight's life, 2, allow a knight's glory to manifest and grow. Glory is a reputational thing, and it doesn't grow in a matter of days, but rather in months and years. And then 3, allow in the full game the management of families and estates with heirs and legacies. That also can't happen if you're playing at the scale of days and weeks. The first scenario, and the only one I'm covering here, is called The Adventure of the Sword Tournament, year 510. As the story goes, whether you're playing as one of the pre-gens or a knight that you made up yourself, you've all arrived at Britain's first and largest city, Londinium, to participate in a big non-lethal battle contest to see who will become the High King of Britain. Currently, the island is ruled by smaller kingdoms, but there is no King of Kings, and there hasn't been one for 30 years. In this scenario, the player knights are first given the opportunity to walk around and sightsee Londinium, and while doing so, they spot the famous magician Merlin disguised as an old man, and the player with the highest spiritual trait value is asked to roll a modified trusting versus suspicious game hint trait roll. If they are trusting, then they have heard of Merlin, the last of the old druids. If their roll results in suspicious, then they think Merlin is the spawn of the devil and the cause of the High King's death 30 years ago. This is a really interesting first foray into the mechanics of the traits system, actually. Dice rolls will often actually determine what your knight thinks or feels about something, not you as the player. The following day, you are put onto a team of red versus blue, and everyone is handed a blunted sword and pitted against each other to start the contest. Again, I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty of the battle mechanics here, but I do have to point out the rules in Booklet 2 do not adequately cover what the GM needs to know to run this battle. You have to read and understand Appendix B, Battle, which is 8 pretty dense pages of rules explanation. I feel like the full-blown battle mechanics of this game warrant an entire video of their own. From a cursory read of the rules, I'd say it still hews too closely to a war game, and I know that the authors tried to loosen that association with this edition of the game, but the war game DNA is still quite evident. One thing worth noting is that no one is trying to kill each other in this melee contest. The idea is to render the opponents unconscious or to have them yield. The side with the most captives wins the day. After one round of battle, or turn as they're called, there's a great commotion on the sidelines, and a boy cries out that someone has pulled the legendary sword out of the stone that sits in front of St. Paul's Cathedral. The legend engraved on the stone said that anyone who could pull the sword would become king. There's this big race from the battlefield to the church to witness this, and everyone will actually roll a horsemanship skill check. If your knight does well on that, then they get a front row spot to the spectacle of the sword and the stone, and will actually pick up more glory points in the end. There's a kerfuffle with King Lot, the sort of big bad guy of the campaign, in which he denies Arthur his status as the new High King, and you can run a single combat round against the Knights of Lothian with half damage, since everyone's still carrying those blunted swords from the melee contest. Doing this will earn everyone more honor when that's tallied up in the winter phase. The GM will fast forward to the next scene of importance, which is all the player knights serving a night shift guarding this sword that was pulled from the stone. Clarent is the name of the sword, by the way. If you're thinking of Excalibur, that's another sword from another Arthurian legend. Player knights roll an energetic, lazy trait check to see if they're asleep or not, and then an awareness skill roll to see if they notice a band of shirtless blue painted Picts sneaking into the cathedral to steal the sword. This is a combat lasting 2 rounds, after which there is a scripted victory and recovery of the sword. If the player knights manage to safeguard the sword themselves, then they'll be rewarded with glory later. There's a narrative bit here where the king and his massive entourage travels to Carlion, and it takes 15 days to get there. Interestingly, the booklet here doesn't make any mention of travel mechanics or any checks that you need to roll, but there is a bit of discussion of overland travel in Appendix C. You get a 2-page discussion here with a brief mention of maybe throwing a con check here or there. I get the impression that travel is not a huge component of Pendragon. The characters are just meant to be where they need to be for a collaborative story. Here, there's another big battle, and this is considered the first real battle that the players will have. It's against King Lot and his horde, who have sacked the outer villages of this city. This is where most of those punch cards can come into play. Each card represents either an encounter or an opportunity for the player knights to take on, and they choose amongst these for several rounds. This battle is somewhat scripted, however. There are specific events that happen between rounds 5 and 8, and the battle decisively ends after the 8th round. So here's the deal. If you actually want to play this game properly, there's no way around learning the battle rules and committing yourself to learning at least some of the concepts of feudal army organization and tactics. That's not supposed to be a chore or anything. If you're playing a game called Pendragon, then it's assumed that you have at least some innate interest in the topic of feudal combat, but it just can't be a mere passing interest. At the end of the big battle, the young King Arthur asks your knights to join his household, as opposed to being mercenary knights. Then you enter the winter phase and tally up glory points along a scoring system based on the events of the scenario. And that is an ideal session of Pendragon, or at least one version of it. A session could also involve a lot more social tests and courtly intrigue, since the traits and passions are broad enough to encompass those kinds of challenges as well. So alright, here are my thoughts on the Pendragon 6th edition starter set. Cons. Extra rules folios are cumbersome. Again, I don't know why they put 15 or so pages of rules onto 4 extra folio sheets, and I certainly don't see any overwhelming advantages for doing it that way. Slow healing could be a drag. I think the GM has to be careful here with how combat is handled in some cases. It wouldn't take too much to kill a knight. Although with that being said, something that I forgot to mention earlier is that knights are often not killing each other. Enemy knights are typically worth a lot more to their lords alive than dead. There's this whole economy of taking captured knights and selling them back to their lords as ransom. So I guess if you're running this game right, there aren't going to be too many fights to the death. Cultural knowledge required. This game really may not be for you because you might not be that much into the subgenre of fantasy called Arthurian legend. It sort of reached its peak in the mid-20th century when there were a few key adaptations and reinterpretations of the tales of King Arthur and his knights that fired up the public imagination. Greg Stafford wrote the game, I assume, out of what was a childhood passion for the genre, him having grown up during the peak of it in the 1950s and 60s. If you don't know much about Arthurian legend, but you're curious, then here's a list of media that you can watch and read in order to get a better feel for it. Movies. Excalibur from 1981. This is a definitive cinematic version of the Arthurian legends, capturing the mystical and tragic elements of the story. Some people call it a cult classic, but I just think it's alright. It's good. Monty Python and the Holy Grail from 1975. This is a comedic, satirical take on Arthurian lore, and it is most definitely a cult classic. Surprisingly, it gets the spirit of Arthurian legend correct, but obviously it's a slapstick comedy. The Sword in the Stone from 1963. This is a Disney animated classic about young Arthur and his training under Merlin. I imagine that it was this very film that inspired the people of Greg Stafford's generation to know and love Arthurian legend. King Arthur Legend of the Sword from 2017 is a more hardcore, modern, action-driven retelling of the origin story of Arthur and Excalibur. It was directed by Guy Ritchie and got mixed reviews, but you could definitely derive some darker, more visceral imagery from it than from the mid-century stuff. The Green Knight from 2021 is based on the 14th century poem Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, and it follows Sir Gawain, played by Dev Patel, as he embarks on a quest to confront the enigmatic Green Knight, facing trials that test his honor and courage. It's a stunning film, if you haven't seen it, and acts as a thought-provoking exploration of themes like chivalry, nature, and fate, among other things. The hope and the wish that I think everyone had after watching this movie was that there would be more movies like this. Just storytelling in its purest and most gripping form. TV shows. Camelot was a show on Starz that ran for 1 season in 2011. It's definitely a grittier, more adult-oriented version of Arthur's rise to power. I mean, if you've watched all the stuff listed up to this point, you might as well watch this one. Books. Le Mort d'Arthur, or The Death of Arthur by Sir Thomas Malory, published in 1485, is the source book for Pendragon. It's the quintessential text of Arthurian legend, compiling many of the earlier stories into one comprehensive narrative. This text is free to read online, and you can also get a nice faux leather-bound copy of it on Amazon. Look, it's a lot of reading, but you're probably not going to get a better command of Arthurian legend than by reading this. All the movies and TV shows are just reimaginings, adaptations, interpretations of the original. Nothing will beat the source material if you're trying to play or run Pendragon. The Once and Future King by T.H. White from 1958 reinterprets the legend with more modern philosophical depth and humor and embodies the key themes of Arthurian legend: chivalry, honor, magic, betrayal, and the quest for glory. And in that light, reading this book could be just as important as reading The Death of Arthur, because some of those themes are absolutely central to the Pendragon RPG experience. Okay, that was a big sidebar. Let's talk about the pros of this game. The ultimate knight simulator. This game is designed to incentivize the players to do knightly things and aspire towards knightly goals, but also to fall into the psychological traps of knighthood in those pursuits. You are rewarded for seeking honor and glory, but in fact, the pursuit of glory and honor will often get you into trouble, and you'll find yourself not acting or reacting in a rational manner. But this is the engine of creative and interesting stories. The push and pull of traits combined with the potential power of stoking your passions end up creating not just the most interesting knights in any RPG, but maybe the most interesting player characters generally. Incredible artwork. Congratulations to all those responsible for the art direction, as well as the artists who contributed to the visual presentation found in this starter set. They evoke the exact look and feel of reading through a Middle Ages tome illustrated by monks. It couldn't have been more perfect. Great price. The starter set runs about $30 for the physical box, and that includes the digital version if you buy it through Chaosium, and the digital only version you can pick up at DriveThruRPG for $15. This is one of the most interesting starter sets I've come across on this channel so far, and it could probably yield you 6 to 8 sessions of solid gameplay. So the price ain't bad. All backwards compatible. There are some minor differences with previous versions, but they are minuscule. This means that you have access to 4 decades of supplements for this game. The biggest difference with the rules is the combat rules from the old versions, which have an even more wargamey feel to them because of Greg Stafford's original design context. Sample scenarios are great. I really enjoyed playing through the solo choose your own adventure supplement in book 1. It was a good soft introduction into the basic mechanics. And then just reading through the 3 scenarios in the last booklet were very effective in seeing how to apply the game's rules to an actual story. YPWV. In the 3rd booklet, there's a text box that explains the concept of your Pendragon may vary. Essentially, what this says is you can play this game however you want, using whichever Arthurian sources you like most and tweaking the mechanics as desired. I normally don't feel like I need permission to do this, but I did feel myself stepping a bit more lightly around Greg Stafford's beloved and final work. But here he is, saying do whatever you want. And that's pretty much it for the Pendragon 6th edition starter set. Again, Chaosium also sent me the core rulebook and the Grey Knight campaign book. If there's enough interest, I could explore those books as well on this channel. Let me know your thoughts on that. I've left links for everything below, and please don't forget to sign up for my newsletter and Patreon. Links for those are also below. Thanks for watching. See ya.